I'm Kaylin. I'm the education chair for SNPS Nashville, if any of you all didn't already know that. And I'm actually excited to see so many people on here today. I think a few of you haven't been on for the other series or the other events we've had. So this is part 3 of our Vitals of Virtual Communication series, the empathy opportunity, your counterintuitive advantage, that's a mouthful, counterintuitive advantage. So if you missed part 1 with Matt Frankel, that one's about fundamentals of good communication, and part 2 with Donna Corley, which is about when interviews go virtual. Both of those are available on our website, snpsnashville.org, so check them out. And then just a few other notes before I introduce Jeff. We are able to offer CPSM credit for today's session, so if you would like that, please email me your SNPS number. And then be on the lookout for future SNPS Nashville program announcements. We should have some coming up in June and July. And then the CERC virtual sessions that they've turned into the webinars, since we couldn't do CERC in person, those are still going on, and you can check out the recordings, and those are on snps-cerc.org. So that's all I have as far as announcements right now, and getting to Jeff. So we're excited to have Jeff with us today. Donna kind of made the connections, so thanks to Donna as always. He is based in Indianapolis, a recovering architect, those are his words, and the president and chief strategy officer at echoEngagement, host of a podcast called Build Your Brand, and an expert on a variety of topics, including branding, relevance, leadership development, business development, all sorts of things. And he helps businesses communicate empathy so clients see value. So he has a lot of great things to say, a lot of knowledge to share with us. So Jeff, I'll turn it over to you.
Great. Thank you, Kaylin. Appreciate the introduction. I appreciate Donna. I don't see her on here, but I appreciate her asking me to participate in this series. I'm not from Nashville, so I'm the outsider. I was telling Kaylin I was watching Matt's presentation and Donna's presentation, and it's all one big happy Nashville family. So thank you for allowing me to the table. I do enjoy getting down there and working with a couple of clients down in that area on occasion. So you're in a beautiful place. Matt and Donna did a great job of covering presentation techniques and best practices. They covered, what has changed. I really liked Matt's approach. These are the things that have changed, but, and Donna went through this as well. Some things have changed, but some things have stayed the same. Knowing that they went through that, I'm going to take a little bit different spin on today. Some of the things that I talk about will be the same as what we would have talked about 16 weeks ago. Some of them will be different, and really the difference, and I'll talk about this, but the difference will be in the amplification of the effects that we see. I think that's the real big difference. Obviously, platforms are different and things like that, but so I'll get into the what's changed and what hasn't as well, but I wasn't going to get into presentation techniques and training your team on those techniques as much, because I think Matt and Donna did a great job of covering those things. In fact, I actually took some notes for myself when I was watching those. So thanks, Matt and Donna. Appreciate the help. But before we get started, I thought I would ask number one. And again, if you'd like to turn your camera on, please feel free, because I am going to try to make this very conversational. Who attended Matt's session? Let's just do it that way. How many people attended Matt's, by show of hands, or do you have the toolbar at the bottom where you can wave? Is it down there? I don't know. Let's see. Okay, looks like Blair, yes. Kaylin, yes. So a few people did. All right. And then on the heels of that, who attended Donna's? I guess I could have done this more easily. Who didn't attend any of them, right? Turn the chat on. And so Anna says she didn't attend, but she watched the recording, which is actually what I did as well. So it's kind of a mix. What questions do you have before we get started? What questions do you have that haven't been answered in the first two sessions? We're in the third of a 3-part. So what questions do you have that weren't answered in the first two that we need to make sure that we cover before we leave here today? And you can either call it out or put it in the chat, either way you're comfortable. But I want to make sure that we get to everything. It's been a series on this virtual communication. So are there things that haven't been covered yet that I need to make sure that I cover? Anyone? Bueller? Nobody? All right. Kaylin was kind enough to, no, go ahead. Anyone?
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yes.
You can hear me. Okay. I called in with my phone. I can see with my video, and I don't know, I'm getting technology overload. So I don't know what I want you to cover or what questions I have, but I will tell you that I was interested and intrigued by the title of your session, and just by the sheer default of the fact that you are different from Matt and Donna. And I've heard both Matt and Donna in the past. And I was really curious as to what your content was going to contain, simply because it seems so different than what we've seen or heard in the past. So I don't really have a great response in terms of what exactly do I want to see. But just know that if it is different, looking forward to hearing it.
Okay. I appreciate that. And it's, so you'll hear me talk a lot about empathy, obviously. I mean, it's in the title, and there's even a hashtag you can use up at the top of my screen if you want to post anything about it. But we're going to dig deep into empathy and how that, you it's Anna, right? Anna, you mentioned difference. And I think one of the traps that we fall into as marketers, and this is not unique to the AEC world. I mean, we hear this comment from marketers all across the board that they'll talk about differentiation, right? It's important. We have to be able to differentiate ourselves from our competition. And the fact of the matter is that if we can't differentiate ourselves, if we, in the eyes of our ideal client, and I'll talk about ideal client a lot, because in my view, that is the only client you should be pursuing. Have you defined your ideal clients? If in the eyes of our ideal clients, we look the same and we sound the same and we act the same as everybody else that they view as our competition, it's another important note. They have the control of both of those things. It's in their eyes and their view of who our competition is. If we look the same, sound the same, and act the same as everyone else, then to them we are in fact a commodity, right? Architects and engineers often complain about being commoditized or feeling like they're being seen as a commodity. Well, that's the thing. So differentiation becomes important, right? But what's even more important than differentiation is relevance. So let that sink in for just a second. Differentiation is one thing. Relevance is everything, right? So Matt talked a lot about the shortlist interview room, right? If your team, whether you're doing it on Zoom or you're actually to the point, I don't know when, sometime in the future, where you're walking into a room again and presenting to a shortlist, a selection committee. Let's just say your team all dressed in yellow tuxedos with yellow top hats, and you walked in. You'd be really different, right? Does that have anything to do with the context of the interview? Does that have anything to do with what that selection committee and that potential client cares about? I'm going to go out on a limb and say probably not. So you were differentiating yourselves, but was that relevant to them? And the answer is probably not. And so differentiation is one thing, relevance is everything. And so that's one of the reasons that it's so important for us to dig into empathy and understand what empathy is, how we get there, and the importance of it. So that's kind of the setup for this conversation today. And so the next question that I have for all of you, and throw out your answers, what are the 3 things? And again, this is whether we're on a Zoom meeting, whether it's a team meeting, whether it's an interview situation, whether it's a live, an in-person interview. We're struggling to remember what those things were even called. No matter the setting, what are the 3 things that you have to be able to accomplish, the 3 goals that you have to have in order for that to be a successful meeting, especially if there's a project at stake? Think about that. What are the 3 goals that you need to have? Anybody, just start throwing things out there. I know it's wide open. Any ideas?
This is so hard. A message that resonates.
Okay, a message that resonates. And why would it resonate? How would it resonate, maybe?
You'd have to understand what they're actually wanting or looking for, what their hot button was, in order to have a message that resonates.
Sure. And Linda said in the chat, their pain points, right? That's exactly right. And so when we're talking about their hot buttons or their pain points, we're looking for points of connection, right? And so one of the things that we have to do in any meeting, and especially, and I don't know what matters the most to you yet about this particular presentation, whether we're talking about a short list interview or it's a team meeting. I know several of you said that many of your virtual meeting experiences have been team meetings and maybe a happy hour. I did see at least one response that said an interview, but especially in an interview situation, but really in any of them, we have to create a connection. So that's one of the 3 goals that we need to have. Any idea what a couple more goals might be? And think about it maybe in terms of the timeline of a meeting, right? It's not a static thing, right? We make an introduction, it's not over at that point. So it's got to extend across 20 minutes, half an hour, something like that. So what else is important beyond connecting? How about engaging, right? I'm trying to engage with you now. We have to be able to engage with the other squares on the screen or the people on the other side of the table, right? If we're not engaging, maybe you've heard the term or the phrase that the best presentation is a conversation, right? I don't remember if Matt specifically covered this, but I know he certainly shares this view, and Donna as well. If you can go into a quote unquote presentation and turn it into a conversation, you have a much higher probability that you're going to come out of that, with everything going in your favor. That engagement, that level of engagement, is very important when we get into those types of situations, and it's even more important when we get into a virtual environment like this. I've got to look at my Post-it note. Someone asked, they asked, how do you keep people engaged and focused? And so in my list of 3 answers, it was connecting, engaging, and focus. So we've got to connect at the beginning, right? We've got to have a starting point together because we're going to go on this journey for the next hour or whatever the time frame of the meeting is. We need to engage. And I'm going to use one example of an interview that happened recently to touch on all of these things, because it was really, frankly, it was pretty horrific what happened. But we've got to have a connection point, some place to start the journey from. We've got to be able to engage because we're on this journey together. The worst possible scenario is basically a talking head to a group of people. And then we've got to keep people focused, right? Because especially in these new virtual environments, it's really easy to check our emails and to and I'm not calling anybody out here. This is just the reality of the situation that we're in. It's really easy to keep the camera turned off so that you can work on getting that proposal out the door, or that you can deal with your kids because now suddenly you're also a part-time homeschool parent, or whatever the situation is, right? That's the reality that we're dealing with, especially in these virtual environments. When we get back to a live environment, it's still important that we're able to create a connection, that we're able to engage, and that we're able to keep people focused. That has not changed. Again, I think it's amplified, right? When we're looking at each other as tiny little rectangles, I guess they are technically, on a Zoom interface. It's amplified because it's even harder, right? We have those distractions that are built in around us, especially if we're at home or something like that. But the connecting, the engaging, and the focus is even more important in the virtual environment, but certainly important in the live in-person version as well. Again, if we're not doing those three things, we're not going to win the project. I mean, it's that simple. If you can't make the connection, if you can't engage, if you can't keep people focused, you're not winning. You're just not going to win, even though you may be the most qualified, you may be the most experienced, et cetera, et cetera. You're not winning if you can't accomplish those three things in the interview situation. In the team meeting, it's similar, right? Many of you have been working remotely, probably with remote teams for at least, well, in your state, I think many of you may be going back to the office. I see some of you are in offices, but how do you manage teams, right? How do you keep teams on task and engaged? In a team meeting, it's the same thing. You've got to connect, you've got to engage, you've got to focus. And so what I'd like to talk about today is, how do we use empathy to accomplish those things, right? I started out this presentation, so to speak, with a question. What question do you have that wasn't answered in session 1 with Matt, that wasn't answered in session 2 with Donna? Or maybe it's a new question that you said, you know what, the series is about virtual communication. I've got this question. It hasn't been answered yet. Jeff, I really want you to be able to answer this question. That's an example of a great way to make a connection when you go in and you start a presentation, or it's a team meeting. Think about starting a presentation with a short list, a selection committee, and asking a question like that. Listen, I know that we're one of 3, we're one of 5, whatever the short list is. I know that you've sat through a lot of these presentations already. Before we get started, I just want to make sure that we cover and answer every question that you have. So are there any questions that haven't been asked so far in the presentations that you've seen so far? That may seem a little bit counterintuitive. It may seem like, wow, are we allowed to ask a question like that? I'd encourage you to ask that question even before you introduce yourself, introduce your team, because you're starting out by letting the committee, by letting the team, whatever the context is, you're letting them know that you care about them, that you are trying to engage with them. You're driving towards a point of empathy as a starting point for having this conversation with them. And there's something that we need to understand. You can see up in this corner, whichever corner that is for you, upper left, I think, upper right, I think for you, a hashtag that says ego versus empathy. There's this interesting phenomenon that comes from neuroscience. There's this interesting thing about the human brain. I promise this isn't mine. The human brain is really, whoops, the mind is blown. The human brain is really in your head to do, first of all, to keep you alive, right? The human brain is always asking, when you're encountering some sort of stimuli, the first thing your brain asks, is this a danger to me? Is this going to help me survive? Is it going to help me thrive? Is this something that I want to know more about? And so because of the way that our brains work, because of the way that our brains process information, we view everything, especially at the very beginning, at the very intersection with whatever that stimuli is, we view everything through a lens that's labeled, what's in it for me, right? What do I need to know about this? Does it help me survive? Does it help me thrive? And because of that, when we start out from a point of ego, and not to throw architects or engineers under the bus, but this runs rampant through all professional services, and you can understand why. Whether you're an architect, an accountant, an attorney, an engineer, whatever you do, or maybe it's your team members, whatever they do, they're the bona fide experts, right? They're licensed, they're educated, they're experienced. They have all of these qualifications. And so it's perfectly natural for you to introduce your team and say, hey, we are ABC Architects, and we've done more schools in the state of Tennessee than any other firm. In fact, we're experts on school security, which is, I think, one of the points that you're really looking for us to address from your RFP. It's perfectly natural for us to think that way. We should go in and we should present that. But that's presenting from a point of empathy or from a point of ego. And when I say ego, I don't mean egotistical, I don't mean egomaniacal, but what I mean is from a point of what we think matters. Now remember, their brain is processing that information through a lens that says, what's in it for me? So when we start out talking about ourselves and talking about essentially how good we are, how qualified we are, all those things, we start out in direct conflict with their brain. We start out kind of basically trying to hammer our way into their brain, and their brain may say, you know what? I'm not having it. I want to know what's in it for me. How is this going to help me survive? How is this going to help me thrive? Saying that you're the most qualified doesn't help me, because that's what the last firm said. And that's what the firm after you is also going to say. But if we start out the presentation, we start out the conversation from a point of empathy. Hey, listen, I know that your most important concern is school security. I know that there are a lot of things that are in flux right now in terms of budgets because of the whole COVID crisis. And I know that you're trying to figure things out as you head towards hopefully reopening school for the kids to come back in the fall. If we start out from a point of empathy, and Anna, you mentioned it, you said hot buttons, and Linda said pain points. If we can start out addressing those things right off the bat, then we start out in alignment with their brain, right? Again, what's in it for me? Oh my gosh, Anna just said exactly those three things that we were wondering about, right? She started out talking about the things that really mattered most to us. What I want you to do to make that initial connection is to start out asking, right? What are the questions that haven't been answered that need to be answered? And then when you get into the conversation, that's a great way to connect. And just like you all demonstrated here, it can be hard, right? It can be hard to get them to respond. It can be hard to get them to talk. You may have to put a little more effort into it than I did, and call on people. You may need to do that, but that's a great way to break the ice, so to speak, and warm up the waters, because you want to create that connection at the very beginning, and then get into the things that matter the most to them as your starting point, right? Again, what's in it for me? Well, wow, we've been talking about school security, yes, the budgets and everything else, and what in the world are we going to do come July or August or September, whenever school starts in your area? If we can start out from that point, we have a lot better chance that selection committee those people that we're talking to, the team members, if it's a team meeting, we've got a lot better chance that they're going to follow with us through the story and through the rest of the conversation, through the rest of the presentation, if that's the context that we're talking about. And so then that leads us towards the next point, which is the point of engagement. So we establish that connection, and then we've got to move towards a point of getting people engaged. So with that, what questions do you have? What questions do you have about the idea of making a connection at the very beginning and using that as a starting point instead of walking in the door saying, hey, we're ABC architects, or we're ABC engineers, we have this experience, et cetera. And one of the things that I want to point out, because that's often the way that we start out our presentation, remember, if it is the context of a shortlist interview, someone opened the door and they stuck their head out into the hall and they said, hey, ABC architects, we're ready for you. Why in the world would you waste the three most valuable minutes of your presentation telling them something they already know, right? They open the door, hey, ABC architects, and you come in and say, we're ABC architects, right? We can get to that. They already know that. We can get to those things later, but those first 3 minutes are vitally important. It's the most important. It's like breakfast. It's the most important 3 minutes of your presentation. So don't waste it on introducing yourself. Don't waste it on starting from a point of ego. Spend it on making that connection and starting the journey into empathy. So what questions do you have about any of those things? Anyone? Come on, you got to have. Debbie says relationship building. Right. And that's a really great point. I think most of you would probably agree. Your marketers in the AEC world, relationship building is just vitally important. Most of you probably say something like 80% of our work comes from repeat clients and referrals, some big number. That's relationship driven, right? And at a micro scale, that's what we're talking about in terms of making the connection. We're making a connection. We're using empathy to establish that relationship, and we're going to build that relationship over the course of our 20 minutes or 30 minutes or hour, whatever we have to present. Matt had great advice when he said plan on about half of the allotted time for your presentation. We're gonna spend that amount of time building that relationship, because at the end of if we fast forward to the end of the presentation, if we fast forward to the end of the conversation, what happens is that selection committee, they go off to deliberate, right? They go off to another room. You don't ever get to be there when they go off to deliberate. So someone has to carry your message. Someone has to tell your story for you. Someone has to carry your flag for you. So you're in a process of making that connection, engaging, keeping them focused so that they're ready to carry that flag out the door with them as they go off to deliberate, because you need someone to advocate for you. You need someone to advocate for you in your favor if you have any hope of winning the project. And Anna says, it makes complete sense. Think that you're with the people. Tell us a story about the flood presentation. That's a great question. Thank you for bringing me back to that, by the way. So we were, I can't obviously tell all the details, but we were in a project pursuit that, like many of you, probably had pursuits, and you'd made the short list, and then you had an interview time, a live in-person interview time set up, right? It's going to be Thursday. Our time slot is 3 p.m. Well, COVID happens, everything gets shut down and delayed, and eventually it came back and it turned into a Zoom meeting interview, like some of you have experienced probably by now. Well, I think you've probably also experienced a similar situation where our team went in and or went in virtually and got ready to do their presentation. Everybody had their camera on. All the selection committee people had their cameras on. So you had facilities people, you had user groups as part of the selection committee, right? It's going to be, 5, 6, 7 people perhaps. And they were all there. They had their cameras on for a brief period of time. And then everybody, with the exception of 2 on the selection committee team, turned their cameras off. And we knew that the actual decision makers not only turned their cameras off, but they also turned their microphones off. And so at that point, how do you make a connection with people? Let's be real. We don't actually know. We hope they're actually sitting there listening, right? We hope they're actually still in that chair or standing there, wherever they were. We hope they're still there, but to be honest, we don't know if they're there. And our team was not able to get the cameras turned back on. They weren't able to get the microphones turned back on, other than a occasional, yep, we're still here, that kind of thing. And so that also illustrates the importance of making that connection at the very beginning, engaging with questions at the very beginning, instead of maybe the introductions and things like that, to try to establish that rapport, to try to establish that relationship and encourage people. Listen, we're encouraging you to engage. We're not going to say that literally, maybe, but we're encouraging you to engage. We want you to engage. We want you to leave the microphone on. We want you to leave the camera on, because we don't, we'll just tell you, if you haven't figured it out, it didn't go well for us. I've got some questions as to the, how the actual interview and the process went. I think we can probably ask questions like, was this just a formality? Those types of things. But if we're not able to do that at the very beginning, if we're not able to establish that connection and foster that engagement over the course, we don't have much hope of actually, having a successful presentation as we go on. No, it was not. It was an accident, or it was not an accident. It was obviously very, very much on purpose. I mean, you could see pretty much see him hit the button, which I think also leads to the questions. And so was that a failure on our part? Perhaps. I mean, I think we've got to bear some of the burden on that, because we didn't do a good job of encouraging them to leave them on and to engage, and to help us establish that connection. If we had done a phenomenal job, would they have left them on? To be honest, I don't know. I do believe that this one was probably decided before we entered the Zoom room, so to speak. But again, if we want to have any chance, we've got to create that connection. And the idea of the best presentation being a conversation, gets to that next step. It gets to that engagement piece, right? The more questions that I can ask you, the more answers that I can garner from you, the better I can establish empathy, right? The more I know about you and what really matters to you, and the more that I can plug in on those issues and on those questions, the better I can establish that empathy, and the more I can do to engage with that empathy, and I hate to say it this way, but use that empathy. But I need to present from that level. I need to have that conversation from that level, because again, if you're telling me what's really interesting about having conversations with clients and potential clients is, if you ask the right questions, if you engage with them on the right level, they'll tell you what matters to them, right? Many times we make assumptions, especially right now. Everybody is or have been separated, right? We've been we've been apart, we've been remote. I think one of the ironies about being forced to be apart is that it has, with some people, left them more open to connect and connect on platforms like this. I think it has left some people, not everybody, but it has left some people more willing to have conversations and more candid conversations. And if we really think about it, that's our job as marketers, as business development people. I recorded a video to challenge AEC firm leaders to hire a person that does nothing but have conversations with clients and recent past clients and prospective clients all day, every single day. Ask great questions, have great conversations, because that level of engagement, asking, and they need to be trained. They need to be trained to have these conversations. They need to be trained to ask these questions and follow up on questions. They need to be great interviewers is really what it comes down to. But what we're trying to do is engage with them on a level that we can get to the empathy. We can get to what really matters to them, because they'll tell us. If we ask the right questions, they'll answer those questions and they'll tell us what matters. I've used the term over the past 12 or so weeks, I've used the term radical empathy. That's what I want you to do. I want you to get to a point of radical empathy with your clients, your prospects, your recent past clients, because if you can get there, if you can get to that point, they're telling you what you need to say to them. You already know that you need to, when you're creating messaging for marketing, or when you're putting a response together for an RFP, the best thing that you can do is repeat their words back to them, right? You're using their language. You're repeating back to them what they care about. That's especially true in a situation like this, in a remote interview situation. Right? How do we make people feel engaged? Well, if we can understand what matters to them and dwell on those things and engage on those things and use their language and repeat it back to them, if we can know that going in, I mean, that's the ultimate, right? If we can know those things and engage on that level, then we've got a lot better chance that they're gonna go with us for the entire hour. They're gonna go with us for the entire presentation, the entire conversation. I like to use the example of stand-up comedy a lot. I do a lot of speaking from the stage, and one of the things that I do is I study comics, and it's not because I want to be funny or I think I'm funny, but if we think about communications, and especially communication from a stage, comics do it like no one else, right? It's raw, right? They are out there, they're on their own. There's no safety net. And they're at the will of how many thousands of people might be in the audience today. And so if you listen to a comic like Seinfeld, as a for instance, talk about their craft, if Jerry Seinfeld were to perform in Indianapolis tonight, he would say that if he's walking out for an hour set, he has about 15 to 30 seconds to win the audience. So that first thing that comes out of his mouth in the first 15 to 30 seconds, if it lands, great. He earns the next 15 to 30 to 45 seconds. But if it doesn't land, it's going to be a long 1 hour set, right? If he can't land that first bit in the first 15 seconds, it's going to be a long night. But if he does, it starts this process of earning the next 15, 30 seconds, the next 30 seconds to a minute. And your presentations, your conversations are the same way. What role does humor play, if any, in establishing empathy? Well, it's danger zone, to be honest. I could tell you a joke right now, maybe, if I could think of one. But if you didn't think it was funny, I'm an idiot, right? If I can tell you a joke that you think is funny, then, maybe I win you over. I think there's something to be said for good humor and for, being a little bit lighthearted. If you coach interview teams, what's the one thing, there's more than one thing, but what's one of the biggest things that they struggle with when they walk into the room? Is it nerves? Throw something out. What do they struggle with when they walk into the room the most? As an architect, as an engineer, most of them probably don't relish the idea of presenting to a selection committee. It's one of the most common responses I get. Hey, Jeff, I really don't want to do a presentation. I just want to be an architect. I just want to be an engineer, right? It can go so wrong if you're not careful. Yeah, it can go so wrong. Many of these men and women that are on your teams that walk in to present that are really nervous, and they have this air or this idea that they've got to go in and be super professional, right? Well, we're the experts. We've got to really come off as being the most expert team or the most experienced team. And so they start taking themselves very, very seriously. And that's a big mistake. I think that's where humor can come in. If you can lighten it up a little bit and not take yourself too seriously, if you fumble over words, fine. If you drop the clicker and kick it across the room, I did that on a stage once, not on purpose. If that happens, fine. You deal with it. You live with it, and you move on. You keep a sense of humor about it. You got to be really careful about about the humor that you're trying to use. And one of my shticks would be, because this brain does travel with me wherever I go. It's not my brain, I promise. I'll tell a story about experiences with TSA. If you ever want to have some fun, carry a brain in your bag through the security checkpoint. And I've got a real story about a woman a TSA agent that opened my bag, and her eyes got that big and went, "Sir, is this your brain?" So luckily she was laughing by the end of it, and I wasn't strip searched. But I think having good humor and keeping it light is important. Going too deep into that, I think, is risky. Yeah. When the brain prop splits in half, it happens, right? Stuff happens. And so we've got to have good enough humor, and we've got to be fast enough on our feet to play those things off. But hey, we're all humans, and that's part of that empathy piece. There's not a single selection committee in the world that wants you to come in, your team to come in and present like robots, right? We deal with human beings, right? We make deals with human beings. We hire human beings. We don't hire a firm. We hire a group of human beings. And so if we can connect on that, if we can engage around this idea that we're in this together, not to be, that's become a real cliche recently, hasn't it? We're all in this together. We're going to, when we're working on projects as architects or engineers or contractors, it's sort of like a marriage, right? We're going to be at this for a year, 2 years, maybe longer, depending on the type of project. So being able to connect and engage on that level is really important. Competition nerves, certainly fear of not fully understanding the scope of work. And I think that's a great comment. Katie, that's a great comment. And that's one of the reasons to use that tool at the very beginning. Hey, what hasn't been answered? What questions do you have that haven't been answered by the teams that came before us? Because if you can start the conversation at that point, I tell all of my clients, my number one goal is for you to break the selection committee's system as quickly as possible. And most engineers, especially if you're in DOT world or something like that, so, well, they have their checklist and they prescribe the order that we have to present in and all of those things. Yeah, I get it. I know. I understand. That is reality, certainly. But if we can find a way to go in and break that system as quickly as possible, we've got a better chance of, number one, turning it into a conversation. And if we can turn it into a conversation where we're engaging with human beings on a human empathetic level, and we're able to ask questions ourselves, right? If we can interview them, if we can flip the tables if we can get good at flipping the tables and asking them questions, we've got a lot better chance of winning this than if we just stand straight up, click through our PowerPoint slides or our keynote slides and have our bullet points. I guarantee you've got too many bullet points. I guarantee you've got an org chart that we can't see, from across the room, all of those things, which means now that we're looking down at the placemat that you created, right? All of those things, all of those things take away from being able to engage on an empathy level. And they also take away from the focus, right? The minute we do those things, I can't quite read that slide, for whatever reason, or now I'm looking down at the book or at the placemat or whatever. Now our focus is gone. Remember, we've got to connect. We've got to engage all the way through, and we've got to keep them focused, because they're all asking the question, why should I choose you? That's one of the hardest questions to answer. If we start out with, because we're ABC and we've done this for 563 combined years, and we've done more schools than anyone else, and so on and so forth, nope, that's not going to carry us through. Because again, we sound just like the last firm, and we're going to sound just like the one after us. And the next one is going to come in and say they've got 564 combined years. And if you count all their renovations, they've actually done more schools than you did. Those types of things that serve to commoditize us and keep us from making those connections, and keep us from engaging, and keep us from keeping that focus that's required, so that we can, at the end of the presentation, we can hand somebody that flag and say, here, take this into the room and advocate for us. Take this flag into the room when you go to deliberate, and remember our story. Matt talked for a while in his presentation about the story. On one hand, I wish he wouldn't have done that, because I could have done a whole presentation on storytelling. It's so important. But storytelling starts with what? It starts with a main character, a hero character. I've got news for you. You're not the hero of the story. If you want that story to engage and resonate and be memorable to the person you're telling it to the selection committee, you cannot be the hero of your own story. The story has to be about them. It has to be about their problems. It has to be about you, the guide that has solutions to those problems and a plan that's going to lead to the results that they're looking for. That's also a part of empathy. Set them up as the main character, the hero character, you up as the guide. You're automatically starting from a point of empathy. It's about them. It's about the things that matter to them, their problems, and solving their problems and getting the results that they're looking for. Chris said he thinks oftentimes nerves come from fear that you don't know the client well enough, what they want. So striving to introduce empathy from the top could take away some of their fear. Yes, absolutely. That's absolutely correct. So number one, it's our job. It's our job to get to know that client. I know cones of silence and all those things. I totally get it. But you need to do the research however you can get it done, whether it's by making connections, whether it's interviewing tangential people, whether it's looking up articles, whatever it is. You need to do your legwork and find out, like Anna said, the hot buttons, and I think it was, Linda said the pain points. You need to do that research. You need to know that going into the room. People ask me that a lot. How do we start out talking about the pain points and those things? That was your job. You've got to know that before you walk into the room. Beyond that, starting with that question can help us. It can help flush those things out. But I think being able to engage on that level and start from that point of empathy. We're not going in trying to prove ourselves. I think that's where nervousness comes from. I think that's where the fear comes from many times. And that's an ego thing, right? We're the most qualified. We have the most offices. We have these degrees. We have these subject matter experts, all those things that we like to advertise, all those things that we like to say. If we walk into the room not trying to prove ourselves, but remembering, hey, listen, we're in Professional services is how people couch what we do. Again, it's architects, it's engineers, it's attorneys, it's account. These are the professional services. If we keep that in mind, we're walking into the room to serve these people. We're walking into the room to serve this client or serve this potential client. If we keep that focus, right? If we keep that empathy focus, that keeps us away from having to prove ourselves. It keeps us away from being nervous about, oh my gosh, are we worthy, right? No, we're not trying to be worthy. We're trying to be servants. We're trying to go in. A lot of people like the term servant leader, like that idea. That's what we're trying to do. We're trying to come in and understand what matters the most to them and speak to those things. And so if I can do that, it doesn't matter. It doesn't matter, what my degrees are. It doesn't matter what my how many offices and how many combined years of experience, all those things. So I think, Chris, I think you're exactly right. That can really alleviate a lot of the fears and a lot of the nervousness, because it's not about us all of a sudden, right? If we walk into the room and make it about them and not about us, we've got a really good shot. Preparation and all of those things, certainly, that Matt and Donna talked about. Again, if you haven't watched those, go back and watch the recordings of those. They did a great job of talking about preparation and the techniques and all of those things. So if we've prepared and we can get into that room and approach the conversation from a point of empathy, that takes all the pressure off. It's not about us. It's about them. And I think that really sums up the idea of the benefit of ego versus empathy even better than just simply saying we're in alignment, right? It helps us to approach it from a point of empathy. So I know I've burned up a lot of the time. We've only got a few minutes left. What questions do you have? I want to make sure that you get. This is the third of the third 3-part series, so I want to make sure you get everything you wanted out of these 3 sessions. So what do you still need to know, either about empathy or anything else? Don't be shy. How many people have walked into a room, or your teams perhaps, and a lot of everything that I've talked about, again, I went down that shortlist interview tangent, but you can apply all of this to your proposals. You can apply all of this to your messaging on your websites. You can apply all of this to your social media posts, anything that you're doing. Apply the ego versus empathy concept. People ask me all the time, well, why don't people engage with my social media? Because you make it about yourself. Try making it about them, right? Why do people think we're a commodity? Because you're making it about yourself. You're not making it about them. Has your ideal client ever considered themselves a commodity? Think about that question. If they're looking at you as you're a commodity, then start talking about them instead of talking about you, and see if that changes. Because I guarantee, even an electrical commodity, right? Even an electrical service provider who is by very definition a commodity, they don't see themselves in what they do, whether it's on a personal level or the service they provide. They don't see themselves as a commodity, guaranteed. So start talking about them instead of talking about you. Katie, thanks, Katie. Really appreciate that. Greatest takeaway was points about hiring people to ask great questions, and how important great questions really are. That affects it absolutely affects all aspects of the business. I start everything that I do with all of my clients from the ego versus empathy point of view, but I talk about this triangle all the time. There's a triangle that's at the heart of every organization. One side of the triangle is marketing, business development, sales. Another side of the triangle is talent. Your employees that you need to retain, the ones that you need to recruit. And the third side of the triangle is customer or client experience. And all of these things apply to each side of that triangle. No one side of that triangle is more important than any other side of the triangle. It's just like geometry. If you take one side away, it's not a triangle anymore. It's just like structures. You take one side of that triangle away, the whole thing collapses. And so I think that's a great metaphor for your business. And so when we can ask those great questions, when we can engage and look at IDEO, the design thinking firm, they use the concept of the 5 whys. It's not unique to them. They didn't make it up. But the 5 whys, when someone answers, ask them, why is that important? Or what does it look like when that doesn't happen? Or what does that look like when it does happen? Get really good about or at asking questions, asking great questions, and asking follow-up after follow-up after follow-up. So you're peeling the onion. How close, how deep can you get to the actual answer? Because we're not trained to give anything more than a superfluous answer. How close can you get to the real answer, the real driving point? That's where the empathy is. When you can understand that, then you're getting there. That's sort of ninja at that point, I suppose. Well, I thank you all. I apologize. I burned the entire hour. I don't feel like I think there's still some questions out there, perhaps. But there's some contact info at the bottom of my screen there. Hit me up on LinkedIn. My email is there on Instagram. I'm happy to continue the conversation with anybody. I give lots of free advice. I record lots of videos, post one every single day. So if there's something you need, something you want, just reach out. I'm happy to share.
Thank you, Jeff, so much. That was great.
Thank you. Great. Thank you all. Appreciate it.
Thanks, everybody.
All right.